Thank you to Tower Light on Wooddale Senior Living for sponsoring this community education class. Located at 3601 Wooddale Avenue South, Tower Light is an Ebenezer community offering independent senior apartments, assisted living apartments, memory care, and enhanced care suites. You can learn more about Tower Light by visiting its website at towerlightsenior.org or by calling its Director of Outreach at 763-252-9281. I'm Bill Beyer. I'm a retired architect and a trustee with the St. Louis Park Historical Society. Last fall, we published a book on park history commemorating the 50th anniversary of the naming of our historic Milwaukee Road Railroad Depot to the National Register of Historic Places. The book relied on a mountain of information collected and placed on our website over 20 years by former trustee of the Society, Jeannie Anderson. It also relied on an unpublished manuscript written in 1951 by University of Minnesota grad student Norman Thomas, summarizing park history up to about 1950. The book was never published, but we do have the manuscript, so it was a wealth of information for us. Our book is organized by physical topic, as the title of the book describes. It's a physical history of St. Louis Park. So we talk about the land and the waters, the railroads, the roads, schools, and similar physical elements that have changed over the years. This presentation is organized differently. It's going to be chronologically in 3 half-century chunks from 1850 to 1900, 1900 to 1950, and 1950 to more or less today. So given that, we can jump right in. Going back beyond 1850, of course, I think it's important to understand that St. Louis Park was part of the Louisiana Purchase. Thomas Jefferson bought a chunk of land from Napoleon, and suddenly the United States was another third larger than it had been previously. Interestingly enough, at about the same time, the British government mapped the historic lands of the Dakota Native people, the map in the lower right corner, which is eerily coincident with the Louisiana Purchase, although much larger, extending into Canada. In 1841, the Federal Preemption Act gave squatters the right to occupy and later purchase up to 160 acres of government land at $1.25 an acre. So for $200, you could become a landowner. Interestingly enough, the sections 8 and 9 of the Act granted 500,000 acres of land to each state and provided that the proceeds from the sales of those lands shall be faithfully applied to roads, railways, bridges, canals, and improvement of watercourses, and the draining of swamps. The Dakota ceded the lands, including St. Louis Park, in 2 treaties around 1851. In 1858, Minnesota became a state, and this plat map, which is courtesy of that wonderful Hennepin County map collection, the library's map collection, shows the first land surveys of St. Louis Park. And if you look closely, you can see a dashed line that outlines the current boundaries of St. Louis Park. And the little red square at the left side of the page represents 40 acres of land. The initial surveyors came through and mapped sections, which are square miles, and then they mapped the perimeter loosely in 40-acre parcels. They left to later surveyors to come along and subdivide the property so it could be sold to citizens. Of course, the Civil War erupted in 1860, and as an overlay, the Dakota Wars came along in 1862, along with notorious mass hangings of Native Americans in Mankato. But this shows St. Louis Park before one of the main transformations that happened to it, before the railroads came to town. The earliest railroad that came to town was James J. Hill's Great Northern, although it wasn't called that yet. Around 1867, we understand the first train passed through St. Louis Park on its way to the end of the line in Wayzata. But after that, in 1870, the Minneapolis and St. Louis Railroad came through town. Shortly after that, what became the Milwaukee Road paralleled the M&SL through town. But even before the railroads, St. Louis Park demonstrated its dedication to public schools by building the first school in the area west of Minneapolis, which was the Pratt School. And you could find it, if it were still there, at the corner of Excelsior Boulevard and Wooddale Avenue. So 27 years before St. Louis Park became a village, the park had a school, and it drew students from all the farmers who arrived in the 1850s and purchased their 160 acres or more of land in the St. Louis Park area. And if you had ever wondered why Wooddale Avenue has its unusual configuration, the story goes that Jonathan Grimes, who owned the Edina Mills at 50th and the Parkway in Edina, which operated for close to 100 years. Jonathan was a farmer who owned most of what became Morningside, and his children, in order to get to the Pratt School, would have had to cross a swamp at 42nd Street. In his memoirs, he talked about grading a road from his farm down the hill and across, filling in the swamp, so his children could get to school in 1860. Jonathan Grimes' house is on the National Register of Historic Places, and you can still see it on 44th Street in Edina. The railroads, as we mentioned earlier, came to town 1867 and 1870. The northern dashed line was the Great Northern, and we believe it passed through town without establishing any kind of depot connection, although there is an ancient street that was labeled Depot Avenue. We have no records that there was ever a depot on the Great Northern, so it was just passing through on its way to the West Coast. 1870 came along, and the Minneapolis and St. Louis Railroad paralleled the Great Northern to the south, and shortly thereafter the Milwaukee Road butted up against it, so there was a double rail line just north of Excelsior Boulevard going through the park. History has it that the village of St. Louis Park was named for the Minneapolis and St. Louis Railroad, whose depot you see there. It was an arrangement made by real estate speculators from Minneapolis and railroad executives, and people in the park really didn't have a whole lot to say about it, but we believe that's the real and true story of how St. Louis Park got its name. The steam engines for the Milwaukee Road and the MS&L chugged through town and were not the best neighbors for many years. Noisy, smelly, and loud. In 1874, the first industry came to St. Louis Park, and we pointed out on these two aerial photos from much later, of course. The Day family bought some property on Minnehaha Creek and were convinced they could create a flour mill on that property. So they dammed up the creek, created what was called the Globe Mill. They were snake bit from the beginning. The Day family suffered a series of calamities over the first 2 years and ended up letting their mill go to the bank, who foreclosed on it in 1876. And it eventually was sold to Peter Schuessler, who operated it until close to the end of the 1800s. Interestingly, the flour mills on Minnehaha Creek, there were two, one at Edina Mills, as we mentioned at 50th Street, and one upstream at Minnetonka Mills, where the city of Minnetonka was founded just below its outlet from Lake Minnetonka. In both those cases, there was about a 12-foot drop of water and sufficient water power to run a flour mill. But in St. Louis Park, through which the creek runs, it only drops 10 feet over the entire distance through St. Louis Park. So when the Day family dammed up the creek and created a mill pond, whose ghost you can still see on the aerial photo from 1940 on the left, there could only have been about 5 feet of head to create water power for the mill. And indeed, later they added steam power because the water was sort of intermittent, wet and dry years, wasn't enough to mill flour. But eventually, the mill site was completely lost to history. In the early 1950s, what is now the Japs Olson building was built over the mill pond, and right across the street where the mill was another building that's since been torn down as well and is now the site of the Japs Olson parking lot. The first industrial use in St. Louis Park was a bust. There was more to come in the way of industry. Another wonderful map from 1886 shows the railroads having come through St. Louis Park, and if you look closely at the parcels, the land has changed hands and been subdivided and has pretty much been sold off to farmers in the area. The gentleman at the top is Joseph Hamilton, who was the first mayor or council president in 1886. His house, built in 1890 on Goodrich Avenue, still stands. The photo on the right is just last year. And he was the Energizer Bunny of St. Louis Park. He served as mayor at least 3 times. He was the school superintendent a couple of times. He was the secretary of the local Grange, which is a building that's been preserved in Edina. He was a farmer and builder of houses, and he also started one of the first commercial stores in St. Louis Park. Built a building in what became the first downtown, which stood opposite where Soda Clothing is now in the Walker Building. However, it burned down in 1957. Joseph Hamilton is remembered as one of the founders of St. Louis Park, although another 30 or 40 farmers really went with him to make it into a village in 1886. Around 1890, another one of St. Louis Park's early benefactors and founders decided that Minneapolis needed an industrial suburb along the lines of Pullman, Illinois. And T.B. Walker had already made his fortune in logging and was a leading citizen of the city of Minneapolis. He and his consortium of businessmen were thwarted in their attempts to annex what was the Midway district in St. Paul now into Minneapolis. So he turned his sights west and talked his cohorts into investing in industry in St. Louis Park and using the Minneapolis and St. Louis and Milwaukee Road railroads as the main driver of industrial development. In essence, around between 1888 and 1890, Walker and his consortium of real estate speculators bought up close to 3 square miles at the core of St. Louis Park and replatted it. It took a surveyor 2 years to create the new plats, and he also extended a loop of railroads, an early railroad roundabout, which served as the focus of multiple industries, which Walker and his people attracted to St. Louis Park. At the same time, he built dozens of workers' houses on narrow 25-foot lots surrounding his industrial concerns so that workers would have a place to live, a modest two-story house, but they could also walk to any one of 6 or 8 operating factories on the railroad roundabout. One of the things that industrial property found attractive was swampland. So Walker built his core industrial uses on the northern end of what had been called the Big Swamp in St. Louis Park. When you drive down Lake Street from Minnetonka Boulevard, diagonally going southwest to what is now called Walker Street, you find that Walker platted the diagonal street mainly to serve as a direct streetcar line to his industries and his initial development of downtown. So between 1888 and 1892, T.B. Walker was going to orchestrate the greatest railroad suburban industrial place for jobs in the Midwest. Unfortunately, he ran into something called the Panic of 1893. The lower left photo is the Walker Building, which still stands looking almost the same and is occupied by Soda Clothing. It originally had 3 sections. The one-story section on the lower right was destroyed by fire in 1917, and we have no photos of the original building, but it was the core of downtown, with Joseph Hamilton's building right across the street. Collectively, the 2 buildings were called the Brick Block and attracted multiple venues, including Doc Brown's Pool Hall. About 1899, again attracted by the railroads, the grain industry built grain elevators along the rail lines to store grain for before it was milled. And in 1899, Charles Hagelin and a Mr. Peavy of the flour fortune built the first concrete circular grain silo in the world as an experimental building. Nobody knew if concrete could actually do the job. All of the wood grain elevators that were built were susceptible to fire, and many of them burned down and exploded. 1899, the Peavy Hagelin experimental elevator was built, and in the spring of 1900, it was proved to actually work. So its offspring, which are virtually hundreds of thousands of buildings like it, collected in multiple bundles all over the world, started right here in St. Louis Park. And the silo, which is now part of the Nordic Ware site and serves as advertising for them, was the second building in St. Louis Park put on the National Register of Historic Places. This map, which is one of our prized possessions in the collection of St. Louis Park, is a very detailed look at mapping the city about 1895, after Walker built his factories, which are on the railroad lines at the left. You can see on the far right one of the earliest grain elevators, which is just about where Highway 100 crosses the freeway now, and is the site of Nordic Ware. But also shown on this site are the 2 railroad depots, the MS&L and Milwaukee Road, the 1895 Village Hall, which was also the high school at the time, the Union Congregational Church, which still exists there, plus several single-family houses that Walker built. But the irony of this is that the Panic of 1893 really stymied Walker's vision for industrial development and pretty much shut down economic development in the park for 7 or 8 years. When you drive Highway 7 these days, which you see crossing east to west there, left to right on the overlay of Walker's industrial roundabout, you can also see the Louisiana Avenue interchange with its 3 traffic circles as well. So all of the dreams that Walker had for industry are currently buried under a highway interchange. If you know where Sam's Club is on the lower middle right, that's about the site of the first industrial buildings complex, the Monitor Drill Company. And the little green box down at the lower right corner is the Louisiana station of Southwest Light Rail. So 150 years after Walker blew through town, there will be new incentive for development around a public transportation node built in the big swamp. The first village hall and high school was the Lincoln School, which sat at the corner of Alabama and 37th Street. Park schools had started much earlier, and Pratt School had already been moved across the big swamp, and several other one-room schoolhouses had been built. There was nothing big enough to hold a high school class, so Lincoln School in 1895 became that venue, and they allowed the brand new Village of St. Louis Park to share some space in the building. So this sort of is our transition between the first 50 years of St. Louis Park and the next. The Panic of 1893 pretty much slowed everything down, and when it just got going around 1900, the Panic of 1907 shut things down again, and both were the result of railroad bankruptcies, which dominoed through the economy and caused many businesses to go out of business in those years. 1900 to 1950, there was certainly a lot going on, 2 world wars and the 2 depressions, which informed most of the 50-year increment. St. Louis Park continued to grow, even though it was interrupted by economic dismay and World War a couple of times. So we proceed into the early years of the 1900s. And the map on the left is United States Geological Survey map from about 1900. It was mapped almost over a 10-year period from 1894 to 1904. But it pretty well shows that Walker's core, all of which was south of Minnetonka Boulevard in the middle of the map, and anchored by the railroads on the south part of the city, was virtually the entire core of St. Louis Park at the time. And we colored up the swamps in green just to highlight how much of the city really was wetland and in many cases undevelopable property. On the right, Marie Hartman sits on the MS&L or Milwaukee Road track. I think it's probably Milwaukee Road because there are none to the south beyond her in 1937. Marie was the founder of the St. Louis Park Historical Society and lived a stone's throw away from this photo on Dakota Avenue all of her life. Another snapshot from the early 1900s shows that the cities of Minneapolis and St. Paul had not stood still at all and were connected by what became the largest interurban streetcar system in the United States, which in the 1920s comprised over 525 miles of streetcar track. The Twin Cities Rapid Transit System in 1895 purchased T.B. Walker's Lonely Lake Street streetcar line and incorporated it into the system. If you look closely, you can see the dead-end streetcar line coming into St. Louis Park. The main line, Como Harriet, which took you from all the way from St. Paul out to the Excelsior Amusement Park, passed through Morningside and Edina before heading west to Hopkins and Excelsior. In 1910, we have in our collections a photograph from the backyard of a house that still exists on Dakota Avenue, the Herbert Carlton House. This was donated by his great-great-granddaughter, but it looks north and shows the Monitor Drill Company industrial development, which was the biggest employer in St. Louis Park at the time and for many years. It was one of Walker's first industries to be attracted to the city of St. Louis Park. You can barely see in the foreground what appears to be piles of fill, and that eventually, by 1915, was the base for the Dan Patch Railroad, which came through the park from south to north 45 years after the other railroads had established their service. In 1937, a high school sophomore named Margaret Fornell climbed the water tower on Highway 7 in Brunswick in the city and took this photo of the second high school in St. Louis Park, which was built in 1914. Thomas B. Walker still hadn't recovered from his real estate losses in the Panic of 1893 and donated the land for the high school in lieu of paying his back taxes on the residential properties. Just to the left of the high school is the St. Louis Park State Bank, which opened in 1915. So Margaret was a little-known daredevil from the class of 1937 in St. Louis Park High, and she left this photo to the society of the high school that is no longer there. She took the picture in 1937, but you can imagine how empty the land was in 1914 when it was built. We have a great photo of the St. Louis Park State Bank, which unfortunately was torn down in around 1960. Even more unfortunately, the bank had been started by a Minneapolis real estate speculator along with a dozen other banks spread out in small rural communities across the state of Minnesota. And in 1919, the state bank superintendent realized they were all bankrupt and shut them down. We have no idea how many farmers and pensioners and regular citizens lost their life savings. We expect the number was high. The bank never reopened, and as I noted before, sadly it was torn down in 1960. It was really quite a beautiful Greek revival structure. Surprisingly, the bank looter who created the bank, along with a dozen others, used this exact design in little towns across the state from Tower, Minnesota to Waconia and St. Bonifacius, New Prairie and Skyburg, towns that are now ghost towns. Around the middle of the decade from 1910 to 1920, a lot was going on, of course. The AAA organization started in Minneapolis, the American Automobile Association, and they built a clubhouse out on the Minnesota River bluff overlooking the river valley. In 1908, the Model T Ford, upper right, was introduced at a cost of $890. By 1914, the Model T could be had for $290. In Minnesota, in 1903, there were only 920 automobiles registered in the entire state, but by 1920, there were 324,000. So the transformation of society by the automobile really did explode between 1910 and 1920. At the same time, 1915 was when the Dan Patch Railroad came to town, which is a story in itself, especially because Dan Patch was the most famous racehorse in the history of the world and was used to advertise breakfast cereal, toothpaste, razor blades, and any number of other promotional items. The Dan Patch was supposed to be an electric railroad, allowing commuters to come to Minneapolis from Northfield, but it never quite realized its potential because in 1916 the horse died, and 2 days later the horse's owner died. So the railroad was bankrupt within a week and changed hands, being run by Minneapolis, Northfield, and Southern Rail Line as a freight line for many years, and it still runs today, operated by the Northern Pacific. 1916 also saw another major employer in St. Louis Park, the Republic Creosote Factory, come to town. It moved its operations from downtown Minneapolis, where the coal gasification operations of Minigasco created the creosote as a byproduct, and the company used creosote to soak cedar block that were used as road paving in the city for many years. They needed a little bit more room to expand, and St. Louis Park had nothing but room. So right at the north end of Thomas B. Walker's railroad roundabout, the Republic Creosote Factory established itself and operated from 1916 till about 1969 on this site. And when the Monitor Drill Company merged with Minneapolis Moline and moved to Hopkins in 1929, Republic Creosote was the biggest employer in town for the next 40 years. On the south end of town, just off Excelsior Boulevard, Charles Hankey, who bought 200 acres of land straddling Excelsior Boulevard along France Avenue around 1860, was still baling hay south of Excelsior Boulevard, although the sign in the background shows that he had already platted the first residential subdivision in 1916 for the area that is now known as Minnetonka Vista. From the Minnesota Historical Society, we get some very interesting aerial photos as well from 1922. This one looks north over the top of the Monitor Drill building, which was still operating then. And in the background, you can see Lake Street coming in from the upper right, and the streetcar line terminating there. And at the far right, you can see what was downtown St. Louis Park. And again, there wasn't much to it. It was two buildings, the brick block, the Walker Building, the Hamilton Building, which never really caught on as a downtown. This is a different angle showing Monitor Drill with Republic Creosote in the background, but you can also see how undeveloped the city is back in the mid-20s. 1930 saw a unique building come to St. Louis Park. It was the Pastime Arena, built by Minneapolis people of wealth who owned horses and wanted to ride them in the winter. This was a giant horse barn for training, for indoor recreation for the rich, and the site of many a polo game, apparently, back in the early 1930s up until the war. Around 1943, we think, somebody enterprising put down a wood floor over part of the dirt floor horse barn and invited roller skaters in to try out their skills indoors. Eventually, the horses went away, and the roller garden became a must-attend venue for every Park elementary school child for the next, really, 75 or 80 years. It still operates today. Again, mid-1930s, we were in the Depression, but we were also in peak gangster time for Minneapolis and St. Paul, both of which had reputations of allowing the most wanted criminals in U.S. history to make their getaway and lie low. There's a lovely book called John Dillinger Slept Here about the exploits of the various organized crime gangs and what they did in Minneapolis and St. Paul in the 1930s. Interestingly, Babyface Nelson had his day in St. Louis Park in 1934 in the biggest unsolved murder in the history of the town. Apparently, a road rage incident in South Minneapolis on Lake Street caused the gangster and a colleague to trail Ted Kidder and his wife and his mother-in-law home down Lake Street and down Excelsior Boulevard to what is now Alabama Avenue, kitty corner from Bunny's, where they confronted Kidder because of the alleged cutoff in South Minneapolis. And Babyface Nelson pulled out a pistol and gunned him down in front of his wife and mother-in-law. This murder was never solved until, for sure, in the 1990s, the FBI released all of its files, and interview with Fatso Negre, the guy on the right, one of Babyface Nelson's colleagues, confirmed that Nelson was the shooter and that it all was a misunderstanding due to road rage. Could have been a bigger splash if anybody had ever solved the crime earlier. Again, an interesting interruption to the Great Depression. Two projects of the Depression years, Highways 100 and Highway 7, were created through the Works Progress Administration in the mid-1930s as ways to put the out-of-work masses back to work building roadways. So these were four-lane highways that were constructed largely by shovel and pick and horse-drawn trucks. Really, the two of them altered the character of St. Louis Park as much as the railroads did, and in much the same way as the interstate freeway system did in the 1950s through 1970s, by dividing the park into somewhat inaccessible pieces. On the horizon in this Minnesota Historical Society photo at top, you can see the three grain elevators that existed along the MS&L Railroad at the time, and it's clear they were the biggest buildings within miles. And you can see the WPA out-of-work laborers being bused to the site in a photo from the Hennepin County Library's collection at the bottom. A close-up of the grain elevator, which occupies the site that is currently Nordic Ware. And at the end of the elevator, you can see the P.V. Hagelin experimental concrete silo, which remains there today. In our research, we discovered that the University of Minnesota's Borchert Map Library has delightful and publicly accessible aerial photos of St. Louis Park, the earliest from 1937 up into the mid-1970s. And as we were browsing through their aerial photos, we discovered that in 1940, they conveniently took their photos at such an altitude so that the park could be captured in 4 quadrants. So in our book, we reproduced the north half of St. Louis Park, the 2 quadrants, and the south half of St. Louis Park. And we've keyed the various sites of interest in the city with little red numbers so that people can follow what was there in 1940 and what wasn't. 1940, the population of St. Louis Park was only about 4,000 people. This was before World War II, clearly. Things really hadn't started to happen here. The land was largely undeveloped, although many institutions had been established. And that's the end of our middle segment, 1900 to 1950. In 1941, the intersection of a brand new Highway 100, which was the West Beltway, equivalent to I-494 these days, and the intersection of that with Excelsior Boulevard was the busiest traffic intersection in the state of Minnesota for many years running. Consequently, the development of shopping centers could not have been far behind. So the Lilac Way Shopping Center, which was sort of an accidental agglomeration of a restaurant or two, a bowling alley, and a dry cleaner, started out in 1941 and continued to expand through the war years, although clearly the economic activity wasn't the greatest until after 1945. So our third segment takes us from after the end of World War II, in many ways up to today. The next 50 years were the development of suburban St. Louis Park, a place to live rather than a center of industry, and the incredible population growth that happened with baby boomers from 1950 on into the 1970s. Miracle Mile joined Lilac Way in 1950. Miracle Mile building is at the top of the screen, and Lilac Way, which is surrounding one of the early park water towers, is on the south, with Excelsior Boulevard going through the middle, left to right. Wooddale Avenue can be seen there at the right side, coming up to the corner. Miracle Mile was really the beginning of shopping. People got back from the war, started families, needed groceries, needed clothing, needed services. Coincident with the increase of babies, of course, were the need for more schools. And from 1950 to about 1970, St. Louis Park expanded every school that existed already and built close to a dozen brand new ones in order to keep up with the baby boom. They barely did it. They almost couldn't build buildings fast enough or hire teachers fast enough. The various schools looked pretty much alike due to the 1950s architecture. Elliott was on Cedar Lake Road, just east of Louisiana back in those days, and is now the site of a large housing project. Elliott School also became the largest PTA in the state, with a variety of programs that were models for PTA organizations all over. And even the fathers, had fun at Elliott School PTA events. 1952, Texatonka opened a shopping center at Texas and Minnetonka Boulevard. In 1954, Knollwood Plaza opened, claiming to be the biggest shopping center in the Midwest, even though they knew Southdale was under construction at the time and would be twice as big or more when it opened 2 years later. But Knollwood was a character of the Highway 7 expansion through St. Louis Park, making shopping accessible to everybody in town. The mid-1950s was also the last time that a person could catch a commuter rail line on the Milwaukee Road at the Milwaukee Road Depot into downtown Minneapolis. There were 2 trains a day in 1954, and this photo shows the historic depot at its original site at Brunswick Avenue and 36th Street. The sign on the left that says St. Louis Park was there all along until just last fall, when light rail construction started, and as the area was beginning to be fenced off for construction, someone stole the sign, so we lost a little bit of St. Louis Park history last fall. It hasn't yet been recovered, but we hope that somebody knows where it ended up. The late 1950s also saw a new development, the Methodist Hospital on Excelsior Boulevard, probably one of the first major hospital developments outside Minneapolis. And the development of healthcare in the city of St. Louis Park really hasn't stopped since then. Methodist has been expanded 4 or 5 times. In 1968, the building at the bottom was built for Park Nicollet Clinics, which had been started in the 1950s as a small clinic on the north side of Excelsior Boulevard, where Wells Fargo Bank currently sits. I think Park Nicollet may be the largest employer in St. Louis Park these days at over 7,000 employees. Around 1960, a story that really started with the railroads back in 1870 and was picked up with the streetcar system, the Twin Cities Rapid Transit. In 1960, that story was interrupted because the streetcar system had been taken over in 1948 by elements of organized crime. Kid Can was a Minneapolis leader of one faction of national organized crime by then, and his group bought out the Twin Cities Rapid Transit Company and immediately entered agreements to get rid of it and change it to a bus system. It took Expose and Collier's magazine in 1941 to sort of blow the top off the organized crime angle, and in 1960 there was a federal fraud trial in Minneapolis or St. Paul that convicted many of the organized crime elements and sent them to prison, one of whom was a guy named Fred Osana, who was their corporate counsel, presiding over the burning in the early 1950s of the last streetcar at a site in St. Paul. The story is really as old as railroads themselves, because in 1965, abandoned railroad lines were eyed by a group called the Rails to Trails system. And in 1965, the first conversion of old rail lines to recreational use, the Sparta-Elroy Trail in Wisconsin, started a movement that really hasn't stopped today. The Hennepin County bought up old Minneapolis and St. Louis railroad right-of-way, has converted it into the Cedar Lake recreational trail, and will now construct Southwest Light Rail connecting to Eden Prairie, which is currently under construction, along with restoring the Cedar Lake Recreational Trail. So this is a very long story, really, 1870 to 2020, and it's not over yet because it'll be 3 more years before you can once more catch a train from St. Louis Park into Minneapolis as a commuter. Another 1970 event was the purchase by the city of land at the northwest corner of the town for the Westwood Hills Nature Center. The aerial photo, again from the University of Minnesota, is from 1967. You can see the residential development is almost completely built out. The business park on the north end along Highway 12 is just beginning, but Westwood Lake and the wooded hillside at the southeast were recognized as a great environmental resource and set aside in 1971 by the city for environmental learning. And that story is renewed even today because just a couple weeks ago, the brand new Zero Net Energy Interpretive Center was opened at Westwood Hills. It is indeed a beautiful building. One of the other conundrums of St. Louis Park is nobody ever could tell you where downtown was. By default, Excelsior Boulevard was the center and really the oldest east-west road path passing through town from the earliest days, from the 1860, actually from 1858, when the territorial legislature declared it Territorial Road Number 3. And over the years, it became sort of the de facto downtown. 20 years ago, the redevelopment of what's been called the West End started with moving out uses like the Honeywell bomb factory and other industrial uses and creating, first of all, big box retail, Costco and Home Depot, and more recently the West End retail development, which essentially is the second downtown for St. Louis Park, if you're not counting Texatonka and Knollwood and Miracle Mile and the others, although Miracle Mile has really been subsumed into the Excelsior Boulevard district. Excelsior Grand developments started around 2003 and really revitalized the boulevard with housing, as has West End as well. Lower left is the Walker Building, which was the first commercial building in downtown and is one of the only surviving commercial buildings from the 1800s, other than the PV grain elevator. As we noted, the East Third burned down in 1917 and was never replaced, but a couple of years ago, Soda Clothing bought the building and fitted it with fire sprinklers, so we are not likely to lose the Walker Building, which is virtually the legacy of Thomas B. Walker, the only surviving legacy, to fire, although St. Louis Park has lost dozens of buildings of historic value to fire over the years. On the other end of Excelsior Boulevard, the brand new headquarters for Bridgewater Bank right across the street from Trader Joe's. It will anchor an area that's seen huge redevelopment with Wolf Park and the Rec Center, the Melrose Institute, and more housing, the Ellipse, and other commercial functions along Excelsior Boulevard that will only continue to be reinforced when the Beltline station of Southwest LRT opens in a few years. So that sort of brings us up to today. We could tell many more stories, but we only have so much time. Our book is called Places in the Park. You can order it by mail at our website, www.slphistory.org. You can also buy it in person at the Rec Center and at City Hall. It tells many more stories than we're able to tell in this presentation, and we hope that it will help you if you're a person who grew up in the park and has family photos of picnics in 1950 and 1960 and other events, to look through your old photographs and see if there's anything that you'd be willing to share with us. we'd be happy to let you keep the originals and scan them for the use of the Historical Society, but history never stops, and collecting history is something that we've got to do every day. So we hope that this inspires you to tell your own stories of St. Louis Park history. Thank you to Tower Light on Wooddale Senior Living for sponsoring this community education class. Located at 3601 Wooddale Avenue South, Tower Light is an Ebenezer community offering independent senior apartments, assisted living apartments, memory care, and enhanced care suites. You can learn more about Tower Light by visiting its website at towerlightsenior.org or by calling its Director of Outreach at 763-252-9281.